Hello all, welcome to the Samvad talk. This is we are continuing the theme on VLSI. Today, Professor Subir Roy and his students, uh, Mohammad Basim and Manpreet, are going to talk to us about the new approaches to architecting hardware for machine learning. This presentation will have three different topics, and the three different speakers will talk about them. So, Professor Subir is going to talk about transport triggered architectures. Sheikh Mohammed Basim is going to talk about parallel implementation of Q learning for FPGA. And Manpreet is going to talk about the design and analysis of non intrusive profiling mechanisms to aid dynamic reconfiguration. To introduce the speakers, Professor Subir Roy is a faculty member in the VLSI group and IIIT Bangalore. He has research interests in hardware formal verification, power estimation, performance analysis, embedded systems, and testing and design for testability. He has been with the institute since 2013, and before that, he worked at SCL, IIT Kanpur, Simplicity, and Texas Instruments. And while he was at Texas Instruments, he also served as adjunct faculty in IISc during 2005 to 2010. He obtained his PhD from IIT Mumbai, IIT Bombay. Sheikh Mohammed Wasim has received his MTech in VLSI and BE in Electronics and Communication during 2014 and 2012, respectively. He has industrial experience in the unified communications and networking domain from companies which include Avaya Inc. He has worked in research projects at IIIT Hyderabad, and he's currently pursuing his doctoral education in IIIT in the area of hardware for machine learning and robotics under Professor Subir Roy's supervision. Manpreet is also a PhD scholar, and she has been with us since 2016. She is jointly advised by Professor Subir Roy and Subhajit Sen. Without much ado, I would ask Professor Subir to start the talk. Thank you.
This topic is going to be on some new approaches to architecting hardware for machine learning, which my group has sort of started working on for the last two years. And I will be just highlighting some of the initial things. In addition to Wasim and Manpreet, there are two other students of mine who are also going to be part of the presentation. Unfortunately, I didn't add their name earlier. They are Suraj Alwala, who is my MSY research student who joined last year in 2019. And he is also pursuing his research in the area of hardware for machine learning, and will be talking somewhat about what it takes to build in hardware things like your AlexNet, which implements some of the computational neural network, convolutional neural network algorithms. And the other student who is going to be present and talking along with me on transport triggered architecture is Akshay Godse. He is my MTech student, and he's doing his current project elective work this semester along with me in this topic. So he will be briefly giving the tool related to the design of transport triggered architectures towards the later half of the talk. Okay. So the initial first presentation will be by Wasim and Suraj. The next one will be by Harpreet, and the last one will be by me and Akshay. So this is the thing. But before I allow Wasim to begin, I want to pitch for hardware. And this is something which I had done earlier as well. So let me just repeat it. Is there future for hardware design? And in fact, this is some material which I picked up from article by Ajit Manocha, who is the CEO of Semi. And SEMI is a global industry association which serves the manufacturing supply chain for the electronic industry, which includes the manufacturers, the material and service providers. And then it also targets different other domains by which semiconductors can be fabricated, which is flexible, hybrid, printed electronics, MEMS, sensors, then high brightness LEDs, your photovoltaics, flat panel displays, so on and so forth. Okay. So this particular topic In our digital world, we take semiconductors for granted because the semiconductors have been around since 1960 when the first device was fabricated in Texas Instruments. And since then, it has grown leaps and bounds.
I'm Sheikh Mohammad Wasim. I'm currently going to present my topic, FPGA-based hardware accelerators for RL and CNN. Today, I'll be covering part one of this content, and part two will be covered by my fellow student, Suraj. Before going ahead, I'd like to just give everyone overview of why actually we are looking at FPGAs as part of accelerating this RL and CNN. Before that, just kind of overview for what actually RL looks like, and it's nothing but an area of machine learning where an agent interacts in the environment to and makes certain decisions and receives certain amount of awards from the environment, and the entire target would be to build an optimal policy which could maximize the rewards. So again, when we go for convolutional neural networks, it's nothing but a class of deep neural networks where which is mostly used in the field of computer vision. But again, what is the need? Why we are actually, while be requiring the hardware acceleration for these type of algorithms is nothing but the main motto here is being speed. Other than that, if you look at today's conventional CPU architectures, even if you go with certain amount of algorithmic runs over your frameworks like TensorFlow or anything with your Python based programming, you can imagine how the speed should be. If you go on to run a smaller program with certain limited capable hardwares or like conventional CPUs, you often might come in. You often might get into something like the screen might getting stuck and everything would be possible. The entire scenario over there is nothing but the importance of hardware. The conventional CPU architectures are just not enough for today's high-end deep learning algorithms. By saying that, what is that the hardware which is currently being used extensively is nothing but they are GPUs. But again, GPUs are parallel processing units which take floating point operations and compute over it and provide you certain results. But if you see, FPGAs are more beneficial over GPUs. I mean to say current FPGAs, not older ones. The current FPGAs which are in the market available, for example, see like Intel Static 10 FPGA, which is on 14 nanometer, which provides us with 14 nanometer FPGA fabric. When the group of Erico et al. At Intel actually ran ternary resonate, which is a kind of CNN, they actually achieved a 60% better performance over the then available top-end Titan X Pascal GPU from NVIDIA. So if we see, there is indeed a great benefit for going with FPGAs. You can, I'll again show you certain examples where you can feel very comfortable in judging what the capabilities of FPGA would be over GPUs. Without delaying further, I'll move to next slide, wherein if you can see the diagram, with invention of perceptron in 1957 by Frank Rosenblatt, from there till today in 2019, or I can say last year 2019, if you see IEEE Explores digital library, the amount of articles for FPGA accelerators, especially for deep neural networks, has been grown drastically from there being 1 at 1994 to 69 in 2019. Why is it actually so? It's because if you see CNNs on FPGA, I have given two examples here. It's a conference paper by Chen et al. At FPGA 15, wherein the authors have gone to implement a conventional roofline model based CNN algorithm on hardware, and they have achieved 61.62 gigaflops with 100 megahertz of working frequency. By saying that, again, if you see in ISCAS 19, the authors have proposed an architecture wherein they have reduced the amount of connections between the neurons, and have tuned the network architecture so that it could minimize the parameters. By parameters, I meant to say nothing but weights. So if we see the achievement they have got is something very great. They have, but by saying that, I also want to say that this is something which they have achieved by changing the architectural features of the network. And this is not one, it's a kind of roofline model. So the research is going in both the ways. It is going through architectural changes in algorithm and also optimizing certain strategies on hardware. So this is the kind of picture I tried to give in a brief time over CNNs on FPGA. Well, we come to RL algorithms on FPGA. A recent article in IEEE journal 2019, they have proposed a parallel implementation of Q-learning algorithm, wherein the hardware achieves 1000x performance when compared to conventional CPU-based execution. I have kept a next slide dedicated to this particular architecture. Again, if we see this ASPLOS 19, where Hyungmin et al. Has proposed a FPGA accelerated A3C algorithm. It's a platform where both inference and training has been done for floating point arithmetic, and the results which they have achieved is something very good. They have achieved 27.9% better performance when compared to state-of-the-art GPU-based implementation. And also there is energy efficiency of 1.62x. So if we see here, there are both attempts are being done on both the sides, like CNNs on FPGAs and RL algorithms on FPGAs. So moving further, this is the hardware architecture. This is a parallel implementation of Q-learning algorithm in FPGA. If you see, I have kept a pseudocode of Q-learning algorithm on the left side. And this is the hardware architecture which describes this pseudocode entirely. And it is built of 5 subsystems: GA, EN, RS, S, and SEL. And when the authors ran this Q-learning algorithm for 6 states of grid type world, 6 states. So when they ran it for different fixed point formats, the amount of multipliers, registers, and LUTs which are utilized by FPGA fabric for the Q-learning algorithm are reported here in this table. But one point we need to see here is that the amount of speed they have achieved is around 1000x in comparison to conventional multi-core CPUs. If you see this particular diagram, everyone who are familiar with this Q-learning algorithm, when they just run this Q-learning algorithm in Python with on any I mean to say a type of software implementation, they are what they are actually trying to do is that they are trying to iterate the value function, which is nothing but this equation. If you see this particular architecture, this equation is being implemented by this particular value function calculation module S, this one. This is entirely parallel architecture. For example, I'll keep it in this way. Consider a Q-learning algorithm being implemented in software. The first thing that you'll try to do when you run algorithm is that you allow the agent to take a first step. The first step could be anything taken randomly. It could be like exploiting or exploring strategy also. But if you go with hardware thing, how can you do that random step? How can you take that first random step? Considering this to be a 6 or 16 grid world state, it requires 2 to the power 4. That means 4 bits to represent that particular random state, initial random state. So anything in hardware which could allow us to generate 4-bit random number could be an initial hardware architecture which would be interested in as part of action draw mechanism, GA. This is nothing but this could be achieved by LFSR, linear feedback shift register, which can give us a 4-bit random number at initially. This is just an example which I am trying to give you that the scenario gets completely different when we think it of in software implementation and when think it of in hardware. So if we see this was the architecture presented in 2019 IEEE journal. But moving further, this is our work in progress. This is a part of Minro project, wherein what we are trying to do is that we are trying to accelerate RL and CNN algorithms in FPGA fabric. We are trying to do this as a PSPL management thing, wherein a PS would be processing system, which is RISC-V compliant microprocessor. If we if you see this planted AIH robo's main motto would be to navigate autonomously in the greenhouse environment, take pictures of those plants or horticulture plants in the greenhouse environment, and and try to figure it out whether the plant is diseased or not, and sprinkle amount of fertilizer on it. This is the main motto which we are trying to address here. In order to do that, the planted AIH is an autonomous robot which has in place sensor. Let it be camera sensors which could be a part of external sensors. The data coming from camera sensors is directly taken by processing system, and it is being delivered to the FPGA fabric for acceleration. And here in this RLA is nothing but a reinforcement learning agent, which has the capacity to accelerate both CNNs and reinforcement learning algorithms. Here we are concentrating on building such a type of hardware which is capable of accelerating such algorithms. After that, the output of accelerated the computed output of the acceleration will be provided to sensor controllers, so that the signal being delivered to the actuators motors is in confidence with what we are trying to achieve. So the entire thing is autonomous in nature, but again we are also aiming at something like multi-agent cooperative robotics thing, wherein each planted AIH will be autonomous on its autonomous, and it will be again contacting a central hub, which is again nothing but a hardware which is capable of routing data and doing certain nominal computations. And again, it could be again a planted AIH based robot, or it could be a laptop or a PC being hosted with nothing much of like a data center or anything like that. So it could be a small hardware which is capable of routing and doing certain small computations. If we consider a big greenhouse environment and consider 4 such planted AIH robots which are navigating autonomously, the data by each planted AIH robot will be shared with other in cooperative manner through this central hub. The thing which I am trying to replicate here is kind of distributed learning in multi-agent systems. So this is our long-term goal which we are trying to solve, and this is our short-term goal which we are trying to do. So in short, I'm trying to convey our work in progress through this slide. So moving further, some of the areas which our group is currently working to successfully leverage ML on hardware is a transport triggered architecture, which will be covered further by Professor Subir and Akshay Godse, and also posits, and also stochastic computing, also PSPL management. As I have said here in a previous slide, we actually need to see how the data flow between this PS and PL is going to be, because the amount of speed, because in most current ARM processors which are hardware physical cores in Zinc architecture of FPGA, the data from there to FPGA fabric is actually done through AXI interfaces, which is again proprietary bus interface of ARM. So we need to figure out what could be the masters and what could be the slaves at that particular point of time during this PSPL management thing, and we are trying to solve it to be more efficient. And also we are looking at to store these particular weights, which would be very much important while doing all these neural networks thing. The amount of memory which will be requiring to come up with, I mean to say here, DRAM memory, which will be hosting these weights, which network parameters, and how to access it, the amount of memory bandwidths, everything that might come into picture to make this entire project successful is of course going to be a challenge for us. And we are also targeting at optimizations which are also related to memory and also related to energy or power. By the reason why I'm stating here the optimizations related to memory is because if you consider certain huge neural networks like AlexNet or such kind of CNNs, the amount of memory which we require to store these weights is of course going to be certain around 256 or 500 around MBs. So in order to get such huge amount of memory as part of DRAM for either it will be with PS or PL, we need actually higher end FPGA boards. So that's of course going to be a challenge, and some challenges and opportunities relating to those area in convolutional neural network paradigm, and those things will be further discussed by my fellow student Suraj in further slides, where he will be discussing about what AlexNet which could generate, how much fabrics it might require. So next, over to you, Suraj.
Thank you, Wasim. I'll continue from here. See, this slide shows a timeline of how the convolutional neural networks have gained prominence. If you see the bottom one, it started around 1989. And if you see ConvolutionNet and 1998 LeNet, and from there until early 2000s, there was not much work on CNNs. And again, a breakthrough was achieved by AlexNet, which has changed the way how classification was done using convolutional neural nets, especially feature extractions and everything. It has just worked on, it has just changed the phase of things, how the object detections have taken place. From that, we go to 2014, 15, we have ResNet, VGG, all these have gained prominence and they have been very successful. But today's talk, I'll be speaking more about AlexNet, which is one of the primary structures. And also there are many things about AlexNet which are implemented on FPGA. If you see, AlexNet has, it has like 5 convolution layers, and in between them, there is a max pooling layer. If you see, the first convolution layer has about 96 kernels of size 11 by 11 and 3 of them. And the stride length for each convolution filter there is about 4. And if you see, the second convolution layer has 256 kernels, which are about 5 by 5 size. And if you see, observe the diagram between the third convolution and fourth convolution, there has been some interconnection. This is because the original AlexNet was actually implemented in 2 GPUs. So half the data, data computation is performed in 1 GPU, and the other part is performed in the second GPU with the availability at that time. But nowadays we have got better GPUs. So if you see, there is interconnection between the third and the fourth layers, and the same interconnection you can see in the fully connected layers between the flattened layer and the fully connected layer 1 and layer 2 and layer 3. And finally, there is a softmax layer which adds 1000 classes, which means that there are 1000 classes of objects which can be detected with AlexNet. Now, let us see the challenges what we face when we are implementing AlexNet on an FPGA hardware. If you see, AlexNet has about 60 million model parameters, which account for about 250 MB of memory for storing weight. And this is based on that each data point is stored using a 32-bit floating point. So if you see there, I have just put a data where an approximate resource requirement for implementing an AlexNet on FPGA. The first one is for inference and second one is for training. But for inference, for each image, like AlexNet works on something, AlexNet works on like a very big ImageNet database. There are millions of images in that. So even for even though there are millions of images, even for each image, we compute about 1.5 billion operations. That's huge AlexNet is. So, and here there are two main problems. First thing, the weights. There are so many weights. Because of having 60 million model parameters which are trainable, we have a large number of weights. So definitely we can't store these things on chip. So we are going to go for an external memory which has to be transferred to the FPGA for computation and also updating weights. So AlexNet, for each image there will be update. But now AlexNet is like the update takes place every time for a batch of 128 images. So even in between, the weights have to be stored somewhere else before they are updated for each batch. So that takes a huge amount of not only memory but also computation. And there is one bottleneck, that is we have to get in the parameters to and fro from the DRAM or any external memory where we are storing it. So if you just see the data required, if you see the number of DRAMs required for AlexNet is about 4,320. I'm just speaking of the inference here. And you require about DSP slices of about 6,840 and flip-flops about approximately like 2 million, if you see, and UltraRAMs about 960 and LUT is about 1 million. So this is a huge computation load we have when we are trying to implement AlexNet on FPGA just for inference. And even though we implement that, the main thing everyone's interested is training. So if you see the resource, what is required for training for an AlexNet is like if you have 3 times the actual implementation, 3 times the actual number of RAMs required for training, because I told you as it has to be stored in batches. So batches of 60 each. So first you compute image by image, and your updation is happening only for batch. A batch may contain 128 images, preferably as given by the paper. So until then, those intermediate values have to be stored. That is the reason it increases the memory consumption. And if you see number of DSP slices required, if you see from the previous one, it is just increased by 1.5 times. But because the training NIC requires weight updation, since that is increased. And if you see the flip-flops have to be increased, so we have large number of intermediate registers which are going to store the weights. And you see the ultra-RAMs are also increased. So overall, it is very hard to actually fit on a single board, the AlexNet. And there have been they're trying to fit it in 2 or 3 boards with intercommunication. There are several bottlenecks with that. So on AlexNet, if you're implementing it, especially in the training phase, we have to come up with a method where you might store the training parameters in certain form so that they do not actually occupy more space. But it's still going on. The thing is still going on. That's all. Thank you.
Hello all, I am Manpreet Kaur Jaswal from VLSI System Design. The intention of my talk is to present an overview on the research in the domain of dynamic reconfiguration, specifically in heterogeneous platforms, the different components involved in it and its applications. This will lead to a brief discussion on profiling, which is our focus area of research. It is a technique useful in design space exploration of any implementation and forms one of the key components that can help fully leverage the dynamic reconfiguration in heterogeneous platforms in its true sense. These are the key points that I plan to take you through by the means of this presentation. We are in a fast-pacing technology era, and the applications a technology can serve are evolving very fast. The design goals are becoming more complex than ever before. The research in emerging technological areas such as machine learning, bioinformatics, autonomous robots, computer vision, artificial intelligence, etc. are taking impactful leaps. But as a hardware design engineer, how do we actually view this transition? As evident by the talk given by Wasim and Suraj, from engineering point of view, there are a certain set of challenges that need to be addressed for the same, such as design complexity, which has seen an increase, handling huge data in real time, specific design goals that need to be met in runtime based on the application. I will share a part of some directions the research in hardware platforms is taking in this presentation. Today, the applications mostly involve big data and require implementation in complex heterogeneous accelerator platforms to be able to handle data explosion with higher efficiency, low power, and better performance. So definitely we need a systematic approach, right set of tools, good heterogeneous accelerator platforms. Literature also shares a term on dynamic reconfiguration, which in such platforms can help in runtime optimization for meeting the design goals. The diagram on your left shows a typical design flow. A coder writes a code in a high-level language, the HHL, which ultimately has to be made running on some underlying computing hardware during different phases of the project, such as functional validation, prototyping, and final implementation. The design space exploration is a process to figure out which end configuration for implementation will be the best fit to serve the design goals. So the application is partitioned into hardware and the software portion and synthesized accordingly, so as to have some portions to execute on the processor, which form the software end, and some to execute on the dedicated accelerator or a reconfigurable architecture mentioned as RA, as and when it is invoked by the processor. But this reconfiguration could be either static, which is pre-configured, which is well established, or dynamic, which means on the fly when the system is in execution, which is in research. The equation on your right depicts a typical speed-up relationship obtained when some portion of code, such as specific computationally intensive loop, is transferred to hardware for acceleration. So the speed-up of a combined system, as given by equation 1, is the ratio of the time taken for an application to execute in software as compared to the time taken for a partition hardware plus software system. The time taken using hardware for a plus software system as in 2 is the total time of the execution in software minus the total time the execution of that loop in software, because we have decided to move it in hardware, plus its time taken in hardware, plus the communication cost when both the hardware and the software are interacting, which we also call as communication overhead. Communication overheads is the time required for initializing and synchronizing with the hardware implementation. Now what could happen is that the sum of resources required for efficient execution of such applications could be much more than the resources available in the physical hardware for execution. Also, the available resources could be effectively utilized by time sharing as per dynamic requirements. There could be some regions in the execution which are unable to meet the timing requirements because the processor got loaded and the OS might want to send a few tasks that are expected to occur next to an hardware for acceleration, to a hardware that can be dynamically reconfigured for that particular task. Dynamic reconfiguration or dynamic partial reconfiguration is based on the concept of a virtual hardware, which is similar to a virtual memory, but not that similar, because unlike memory, it's not just storing information, it is acting as a computing element as well. This figure shows how the industry has been adopting reconfigurable hardware architectures over the years in place of having a pure software or a pure hardware implementation. These are the benefits that dynamic reconfiguration and related architectures can serve, such as facilitating dynamic optimization of design goals, allowing more sections of an application to be mapped into hardware in a dynamic context than can be fitted in a non-runtime reconfigurable system. It allows to implement time-space partitioning. It can have the reconfigurable architecture act as a virtual resource for the processor and operating system to act as a memory, coprocessor, or an accelerator. Also help in load balancing like in servers and data centers. Also enhance the application performance by adapting computational effort to the input variations. This slide shows an overall steps involved in dynamic reconfiguration. It starts from demarcating the modules in the application code which are possible for dynamic reconfiguration, and also the space in a reconfigurable architecture that could be allocated for dynamic reconfiguration purposes using the design space exploration process. Then going to the necessity of operating system or any intermediate abstraction level to facilitate the same, like under what, and after that, under what cases would the system opt for reconfiguring some modules on the fly, and to how one can quicken the reconfiguration process by minimizing the overheads and in the end driving the maintenance occasionally. Again, these steps are just generic in nature. Exact will depend on the ones on the hardware that you choose and the application that your hardware targets. So now I'll be discussing about the components of dynamic reconfiguration. First of all, definitely available of architectures that can be dynamically reconfigured in less time is the foremost requirement. Different research groups across the world have been coming up with different various reconfigurable architectures. Some of them in literature are here. Coarse-grained reconfigurable architectures, custom FPGAs, reconfigurable multipotent cells, and DAP DNA, which is digital application processor with a distributed network architecture. Now, most of these architectures are based on having common cells arranged in a meticulous structure with a certain logic in the interconnectivity. CGRA cells are based on coarser level of abstraction, such as of a processing element, could be any functional unit or an ALU matrix, depending on the product requirements. It is a wide family, and the what you put in as a processing element as a cell is not fixed. It depends on the application and the hardware. FPGAs comparatively a little finer than CGRAs, with cells typically consisting of a combination of lookup table, adder, and flip-flop with programmable interconnect. REM's reconfigurable multipodal cells come down to much finer level than FPGA, which is mainly gate level, with the intent of a faster reconfiguration. DAP-DNA is a complex commercial product from collaboration between two companies, IPFlex and Fujitsu in Japan. It consists of a dynamic reconfigurable processor, which consists of a RISC processor called DAP and a reconfigurable coprocessor called DNA. To enable seamless execution between the processor and RA system, it is important to have an OS support for the same. It is important that the OS is updated with respect to which process is executing where, like is it executing in a processor or in reconfigurable logic where. Whether the reconfigured architecture has slot available for any process and software to be reconfigured in the hardware. The timing estimates whether the dynamically reconfiguring something will help speed up the system or instead slow it down, considering the reconfiguration and communication overheads. And then scheduling tasks dynamically such that the dynamic reconfiguration latency is hidden from the system and the system is executing other tasks in that time parallelly. So Recon OS, which is an operating system for reconfigurable computing, is one of the ones in present. Recon OS facilitates the on-demand loading of hardware threads, functionality movement between software and hardware, and multi-tasking hardware slots with the mechanism of time multiplexing. To provide the OS services for the hardware threads, a lightweight software thread is hidden by the Recon OS runtime environment. It is called delegate thread. So the job of this delegate thread is to provide switching between hardware and the software threads, and something which can be hidden from the OS. So OS doesn't see it as a hardware or a software. For OS, it's everything running in software. So it basically masks out that abstraction. So developers can profile their application to do the design space exploration, to evaluate different mappings of the threads to hardware and software and access the performance accordingly. Now, how dynamic reconfiguration can be performed faster? Example, having a custom on-chip CAD toolchain to facilitate faster synthesis and placement and routing process, or compression of reconfiguration bits to reduce communication overhead during reconfiguration, having differential reconfiguration in the cases where something that you want to change in an existing reconfiguration is a very less thing, such as some equation parameter, having configuration caches so that they can store recently or frequently used configurations to accelerate reconfiguration process. Overlays, instead of having an HLL or a bit stream, it is an intermediate layer of abstraction to have facilitate faster reconfiguration or the entire tool process. And defragmentation logic, the way we do in our laptops, for the maintenance of that hardware. So it's about when you swap logics in and out any reconfigurable architecture, you can leave a lot of unused space in between. So defragmentation can help in optimal use of space and reduce the communication cost between different interacting modules. So we have discussed about the architecture support, the operating system support, and the technology support. Last but not least, the area focus of our research is profiling, it being the key to the success of obtaining the optimal platform configuration. Profiling basically means you are monitoring the execution of a code in runtime for the parameters of your interest. The profiling tools can be software-based, hardware-based, or FPGA-based. We are working on a FPGA-based hardware profiler. The difference between static and dynamic profiling is that in a static one, you can get to know all the processes and functions in loop in a high mode, and possibly if it facilitates all the parts that lie in a computational in the code and the computational bottlenecks based on the test data that you are giving for static analysis. In a dynamic context, not all the processes or all the parts could be occurring as frequently or occurring based on the could be occurring or occurring as frequently based on the real-time scenario. So the dynamic profiling mechanism is required for the system to be aware of exactly which process it is currently executing and where it is currently executing, or which process could be needed in future or released in the near future, and to calculate some specific runtime parameters which can enable better decision making to whether it is worth swapping the module in consideration between hardware and software blocks of your heterogeneous platform. Hence, giving a room for dynamic optimization of design goals and efficient time sharing with hardware resource constraints. This diagram is an illustration with condition-based path branching, wherein a dynamic scenario based on the inputs is received, it receives only some portion of the code is finally executes, not all branches of the code are finally executing. So for example, if L6 based on static analysis and put on hardware for the time that it is, for the time it is not being called, it is actually lying idle in the hardware accelerator resource. So it's in a way wasting that resource. Something else could have been put in that place for the time it's not being used, or it's not called at all. Secondly, if something is put in hardware, it has to go back to its parent and other neighboring processes which are in software. It has to return to all these paths or talk to other neighbors, which could be in software. So there is another communication overhead. And in case the parent or the neighbor is not lying in the vicinity. And this applies to entire parent hierarchy. How do we find out a dynamic parent-child relationship in real time, and how much portion of the path needs to be kept together? Coming back to this equation that we earlier visited in the starting of the presentation, having an estimate of time spent for a process in computation, its number of the iterations, invocations, and the corresponding communication overhead is necessary to obtain an optimal partition. And this applies even for a dynamic partitioning process. So to make the process, also to make the process visibility to operating system independent of where it resides in runtime, and preferably not intend to modify any existing software or hardware implementation in order to add a profiling capability, profiler needs to non-intrusively detect and uniquely identify all processes executing in runtime, calculate the invocation and iteration cost, the computation cost, finding the execution paths, the cost of communication, the computation cost of hardware modules related to their time of completion as decided by a scheduler, and efficient use of limited profiler memories which are storing the profiling information. So this is a summarization of what we have discussed till now and how the profiler specifications have come up. These specifications are giving direction to the work that we are doing. So these are some of the references I referred for making these slides. Thank you for your interest of being with me till now. I hand over to Professor Subir Kumar Roy.
So this interest in transport triggered architecture was sort of triggered by one of our past IMTech students, Praneeth Reddy, and he was visiting India, and during the last year's summer, 2019, and he met me, and we were discussing what was the kind of work that was going on and what he was doing. So towards that, I decided to look into this particular area and see what leverage can be obtained from studying this particular thing for our work on ML-based hardware, the thing that we are looking at. Yeah, so much of the material is not original material from our group, but we have just started looking into this thing. One aspect that I found out in all this literature survey was that transport triggered architectures have been sort of seen. If you look at this entire hardware architecture space, which currently is the manner in which most of the hardware things are implemented, much of software is implemented in your RISCs, which is your reduced instruction set computers. So these are your single instruction, which results in single output data being generated in some sense. Okay. Then you have towards the next thing, which implements the DSP kind of architectures, which is your very long instruction word processors, or the VLIWs. They are a single instruction but multiple output, because a single instruction can trigger multiple operations being carried out on on a large number of functional units which are present in a VLIW, and that's typical of what the kind of computation that are needed traditionally in rendering much of your DSP digital signal processing algorithms. The other is where you have so much of these are so-called your instruction based. They are not data based. So where the space of your transport triggered architecture lies is what we call as single instruction multiple transport. And the reason why one looks into this single instruction multiple transport is to exploit data parallelism as much as can be done. Okay. Now, as far as data parallelism is concerned, I think the best possible data parallelism can be done by pure hardware architectures or accelerators, which are designed using high-level synthesis models. So these are also come under single instruction, multiple transports being carried out in the hardware. And we will try to look into the parallels between this hardware accelerator designed using high-level synthesis and the transport triggered architectures, which again implement SIMT using normal processor design techniques. But we will see the parallel between them. And this is something which has not been explored in the literature too often, and which is what we want to research on and see how we can see what ideas can be brought in from hardware accelerator done purely designed through high-level synthesis and use them in improving some of the transport triggered architectures which exist currently. Okay. Now, so let's briefly look into the hardware accelerator thing, which is the focus of what our research group is trying to do, and quickly go through as to how one can design them. So here you have a data flow graph, which we want to realize in hardware. This could be obtained either from a C program, which implements this particular kind of a data flow, or this could also be a controlled data flow graph for all you know. And the idea is that this data flow graph or the control data flow graph have a number of resources needed to implement and execute the algorithm, where the inputs are your the things which are referred as variables are your X, then A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, and A6. And then using all of these this so-called inputs and variables. So basically your A1, A2, A3, A4 are sort of the program parameters, and X is the input variable which comes from the environment, and you want to compute that. Using all of these, we want to compute the Y. And the equations to compute results in the kind of control data flow graph as shown here. The idea is to realize this with the barest number of different kinds of hardware entities which are needed to realize the various operations which are shown in this data flow graph. So you have multipliers, you have adders, and you have also, when you have a control data flow graph, you will have comparators, and you have some other kind of predicate computing logic, which tells us whether something is true or false based on the data that comes about. Okay. So given this particular fact that we have this thing, and what is specified is that the number of resources that are available to you. So you can have a resource constraint design, or we can have a time constraint design, which tells us that you have to design it for the fastest possible execution thing that can be carried out for this particular data flow graph. Now, this data flow graph encompasses a lot of information which tells us about the data dependency between various operations that are carried out on the input set of data that is arriving to the hardware. As well as it tells us what kind of independence exists between the data sets that can be then exploited to carry out the operations concurrently. And that's exactly the kind of effort that is put in by the hardware, high-level synthesis based hardware accelerators. We try to exploit as much amount of data parallelism as possible, which arises from your data independence. Now, given this particular thing, we carry out the first step that we do is we schedule these operations and put them in a scheduled kind of time slots, which is what is going to be done. So the underlying assumption is that all of this is going to be designed using synchronous digital circuits. And therefore, the underlying hardware accelerator is synchronous hardware. Okay. So given that, we sort of carry out the scheduling of the various operations using the as soon as possible scheduling and as late as possible scheduling. And then find out from this particular kind of information as to which are the operations which are more flexible, the ones which have their as soon as possible scheduling and as late as possible scheduling one and the same, they are the least flexible operators as far as their scheduling is concerned. So they have to be scheduled appropriately and earlier. So this is what is captured here in what we call as the information obtained in the previous slide is sort of mapped here, which shows that if I look at operator 3, then the operator 3 has flexibility because it can either be scheduled in the time slot 1 or in the time slot 2. Similarly, you have other operator which is operator 7, which can be either scheduled in time slot 2 or time slot 3. So given this particular flexibility that we have, we then try to fix the operation which has flexibility in it to one of the time slots, keeping in view the restrictions that you have on the number of resources that you can use in each time slot. So that is carried out by what we call as the force-directed scheduling algorithm, and we can do that very efficiently given the fact as to the number of resources that you have at your disposal. So for the current design, we are saying that let's say that you have 2 multipliers available to you and 2 adders available to you. What is the best that you can do with them? Okay, so this is the schedule, which is one of the possible schedules that can be obtained using that particular restriction on the hardware. And given this schedule, once you have obtained the schedule on the right-hand side, we then carry out what we call as the functional unit allocation and the register allocation. Why do we need registers? Is because since the hardwares are shared different for the different operations that needs to be performed, you need to store the output of the hardware functional units, which generate them and store them in registers. And that's why we need to have registers corresponding to each edge, which is present here in this control data flow graph. So given that particular aspect, we carry out the functional unit allocation using what we call as the compatibility graph thing, where we make sure that the operators that are allocated to the different operations in the control data flow graph are uniquely available for that particular time slot. So given this particular thing, we can carry out functional unit allocation appropriately, and that's shown in I've not shown the functional unit allocation, but it can be done based on this compatibility graph that is present here. And then given that from the control data flow graph, we can find out the variable lifetime as to how long the variable needs to be stored in a particular register is what we are looking at. And this pertains to what is the lifetime of the variable. And this lets us exploit the fact that we don't need a large number of registers to store all the intermediate results which needs to be stored in registers, because of the fact that their lifetime varies. And so for example, if I have a register which stores the parameter A1, then it extends over 2 time slots because it's consumed in the second time slot and is made available right at the beginning of the initial starting point. Okay. Whereas the second one is consumed in the first time slot and that register which stores this parameter is then available for being reused by some other variable. And therefore, we can allocate it to any one of the intermediate variables that is there, as long as there is no contention on that with respect to other variables. So given this particular variable lifetime figure, we can do a certain amount of clustering and use bipartite graph matching to find out how to do the register allocation appropriately for the different parameters and the intermediate variables that gets generated in the control data flow graph. And that's what is shown here. So basically we need 7 registers to store all the things, and the manner in which the registers store the different variables at different time points gives us the register allocation specification. And so for example, the register 1 stores the variables A1 and V3. Similarly, R2 stores A2 and V1, so on and so forth. Okay, so given this information, we can then decide based on the data as to what is the data transfers that needs to happen to the functional units, which the allocation of which is shown here. So basically, we assign, given the fact that we have 2 multipliers and 2 adders, we have The mult1, mult2 being allocated to the operations O1, O3, and O2, O4 respectively. Similarly, add1 and add2 are the two adders which are then allocated to the operations O5 and O6 and O7 and O8 respectively. So given this information as to the functional unit allocation and the register allocation, we then know exactly how to carry out the set of data transfers in each time slot. So in the first time slot, which is represented symbolically by state 1, we have the multiplication operation being performed by the data which is stored in register R1 and R2, and the output of that goes to the register R2. So this is what we call as a data transfer. And this is what is referred to as the transport mechanism in the transport triggered architecture as well. Okay. So this set of data transfers that have to be carried out are actually carried out by an underlying finite state machine, which generates control signals to generate the manner in which the registers are written with a certain value and read with a certain value and supplied to the appropriate the adders and multipliers which are allocated to different operations that needs to be performed on the given control data flow graph. So each state has unique set of data transfers which have been identified, and the largest number of data transfers takes place in the state 2. So in all, we have roughly around 8 data transfers performed in the entire to realize that particular control data flow graph through high-level synthesis. And given this information as to what needs to be done in each state gives us the interconnect allocation and the data part architecture, which refers to the point-to-point interconnections that happens. And these symbols are nothing but your multiplexers, which allow us to direct the right input in the right time slot. And that is controlled by an underlying finite state machine controller, which controls the select signals of the multiplexers as well as the read and write ports of the registers appropriately to transfer data to the functional units and redirect the output generated by the functional units back to the registers in which they need to be stored appropriately. So that's the underlying thing which is done in your hardware accelerators, and this is the manner in which you can design your hardware accelerator appropriately. Now, moving back to the transport triggered architectures, what are those transport triggered architectures? The transport triggered architectures are a relatively new approach to doing processor design, where both the programming model and the operational model are orthogonal to that which has been normally used in existing complex instruction set architectures, as well as your reduced instruction set architectures and your very long instruction word architectures as well. Okay. Now, in CISC, RISC, and VLIW, the instructions are the ones which cause data transports, and this happens as a side effect because it is the instruction which results in data being either pulled in from the memory and brought into the register file, and then from the register file sent to the functional unit appropriately, where the data is consumed and new transform data is generated by the functional units. While in transport triggered architectures and the kind of hardware accelerators that we just saw in brief earlier, it is the instructions which signify program transports. Now, what do we call instructions in the case of in the case of your hardware? Because in every state, the underlying finite state machine controller, which keeps a track of the time slots in which certain data transfers have to be executed, it generates what we call as a control word. And the control words are nothing but the valuations of the select lines and the register enables which are generated in that particular time slot appropriately. And therefore, we can call that set of control words as our instructions pertaining to this hardware accelerator. In a similar manner, in your time-triggered architectures, we also have instructions which signify program transports, and these are specifically generated by compilers, whereas in hardware accelerators, they are done by the high-level synthesis tool automatically. So the program transports can trigger any logical, arithmetic, or floating point operations as may be desired to to realize the kind of data flow graph that we saw earlier. Now, because this is primarily driven by transports, the system architecture can actually program the transports, and therefore the transport triggered architectures offer very many advantages, which we will see in a short while. One is the simplicity, the other is the flexibility in the implementation, and the ability to add additional hardware, or what we call as specialized functional unit, which can be meta functional unit blocks more than the multipliers and the adders that we are so familiar with in the context of the CISC, RISCs, and the VLIWs, where much of the functional units are either floating point adders, multipliers, or fused multiply adder units. Okay, they don't extend anything beyond that, but that limitation is sort of is removed when we go to time triggered architectures, and we have a mechanism by which we can include complex functional units as well into the hardware and design them appropriately. So therefore, it results in faster design turnaround times and also shorter execution times. Now let's look at what kind of digital systems have been architected with this transport triggered architectures. So in the digital signal processing domain, we have had discrete cosine transforms being implemented, scalable FIR filters being implemented. Then you have mixed radix of fast Fourier transforms being implemented. Similarly, we have had load density, your parity check algorithms and decoders and coders implemented, then cyclic redundancy checkers implemented. So there is a whole host of very widely used structures which are heavily used in signal processing as well as in communication systems, which can be sort of targeted for implementing efficiently using transport triggered architectures. They have also been used for carrying out complex fixed point matrix inversions as one of the approaches which has been done, which is based on your Cholesky inversion that are there. And then they also have in them embedded what Manpreet mentioned as to the coarse grain reconfigurable architectures, because of the fact that the functional unit and the register files are implicitly present in transport triggered architectures. So let's look at the structure of a transport triggered architecture and how does it look like. Just like the normal CISC, RISC, and your VLIW processors, there are data memories and there are instruction memories, or there could be. So this is the Harvard-based approach that is being followed in the transport triggered architectures, where the data memory and the instruction memory are separated. Then you have a specialized unit which is called the load store unit, which pulls in memory, which pulls in data from the memory, both the data memory as well as the instruction memory appropriately. Actually, it is only the data memory which is controlled by the load store unit, whereas the instruction memory has its own separate control unit to pull in instructions from the instruction memory and execute them appropriately. And then you have the functional units, which implements the different operations that needs to be performed. This functional unit could be a multi operational functional unit, which can do addition, subtraction, it can do comparison, it can do many different kinds of things. So that is also supported by this particular thing. And then you have the register files, where the data pulled in from the data memory are sort of stored and pushed into the register file, and from there fed into the functional unit appropriately at different points of time. And then you have certain Boolean register files, which are typically files needed for implementing certain control flags and status flags which are needed. Okay, and then you have the control unit which pulls in instructions from the instruction memory and sort of enables their decoding and execution. And then you also have certain data which are immediate units, which can be treated as values which needs to be consumed immediately. Okay. Now, in each one of these units, so there is a port which is present and which is marked in the filled your black square box. So these are what we call as the trigger ports, meaning that only when data arrives in these trigger ports, assuming that the data is already present in the non-trigger ports, will the execution be carried out for that particular unit that is present? Okay. The same thing happens with the functional unit. So there are two input ports, one of them being the trigger port and the other being the non-trigger port. And then you have the output ports from where the data which is computed by the functional unit flows out. Okay. And then you have the register file, which sort of takes in registers. So every input port is a trigger port in a register file. Similarly, for the Boolean register file, the control unit and the immediate unit. The interesting thing is this particular piece, which is the interconnection network, which is in some sense pre-configured and therefore gives us the flexibility of moving data from any one of these units to any other unit where it needs to be either consumed or it needs to be stored. Okay. So in the concept of the thing, the buses are the ones which are the solid horizontal lines, which are shown here, 4 in number. And then you have the vertical lines, which are defined as the sockets. And the thing which is present here is the port of the functional unit or any other unit that is there. So the sockets are the ones which connect to the ports selectively and thereby make the connections pre-specified. As to what a socket is, we will see very soon. So this socket can be of two types, the input socket and the output sockets. The input sockets are the things, for example, if I take this particular thing here, there are two things which are being shared by in this input port, and therefore there are two different bus data values which can go into this input port, and therefore that has to be disambiguated. So a socket is nothing but a glorified multiplexer which which feeds data from the buses to the functional units appropriately. Okay. Now these input sockets are tagged with what we call as the destination IDs, which tells us as to where the particular thing is supposed to be. The destination IDs sort of disambiguate between the various ports of the various units which are present along this particular place here. So they can be, it can be the load store unit, it can be the functional unit, it can be the register file unit, it can be any one of these things. And that disambiguation is done by the destination ID. Similarly, for the output values which are generated or the outputs that are generated are also sent appropriately to the different source registers where they are stored. So that is the notion of a socket, and the connection happens when the destination ID is sort of decoded by the socket, and then a connection is made between the bus and the appropriate port through the mediation of the socket. Now, how that happens is through an instruction word, and we'll see how that instruction word is configured. Okay. So this is the other thing which compares what happens in a time-triggered transport-triggered architecture, as well as a normal open RISC core, which is an open source RISC, 32-bit RISC machine, which is shown here. I'm not going to go too much into the details, but the simplicity of the transport-triggered architecture as opposed to what happens in a RISC processor is evident, and there are many issues which sort of mandates the necessity of moving to more efficient data transport architectures as can be provided by your RISC or your CISC or even your VLIW. Okay. Now, if I look at the structure of the functional unit, then the functional unit itself has these things where the trapezoidal things are what we call as the sockets. So you have the input socket, the output sockets being present. Then you have the registers, which are your solid rectangles here. And then you have the combinatorial logic function, which consumes the data stored in the registers and performs whatever needs to be done. And it can be done through a pipeline manner, which essentially means that there are extra register stages being present intermediate between the two combinational logic blocks which have been pipelined. And then the results are stored back in registers, and from there they are sent out through the sockets to different other result register files. Okay. So the inputs to this come from register files. The output from here goes to another register in a register file. Now this opcode decoder is nothing which tells us that this is a functional unit which can perform multiple operations being present. And if we need to perform a specific operation, then we have to send out the opcode for that particular operation to be executed in this particular functional unit. Okay, so that's the functional unit. Now let's look at what happens. So let's say that I have a RISC platform in which I want to perform the addition operation, whereby two values, two operands which are stored in R1 and R2 are to be added, and the result is supposed to be stored in R3. Okay, so this in a RISC platform is given by way of specifying an add instruction and the registers in which the data is to be obtained from and then stored into. Now, this registers are written by load store instructions again in the RISC platform, and they are assumed to be present in the register file appropriately. Now, what happens later on is that as opposed to that, in the transport triggered architecture, we have the values coming in as something which is stored in your R1, R2 by, again, your load store unit, and then they are directly sent from R1 to the space where it is going to be consumed, the data in R1 where it is going to be consumed, and this space, this thing is the functional unit, which is the adder unit, whose first input port is where the data goes. Similarly, the second input port where the data goes, and then the output of the adder is stored and then sent to the register file. So as you can see, these are direct data transfer specifications that have been implicitly that have been specified in the add instruction in the TTA platform. Whereas in the RISC platform, it is implicit, depending upon how the instruction is executed in the functional unit will decide where the data lies and where it is to be pulled from. So that is implicit data transfer, which is present in this instruction. And that's what is the difference between the two. Now, each one of this data transfer can be carried out in parallel, depending upon the number of buses which are there in the interconnect network of my transport triggered architecture. So here there are 4 buses, and therefore there are 4 possible operations that can be carried out concurrently to 4 different units that can be executed. Okay. So that information, so the number of buses decides the number of move instructions which are present in the instruction word. So this is the configuration of the instruction word, where we have a tag which is the immediate extension tag, which tells us that if this tag is present, then whatever is present here is just an immediate data information that needs to be consumed immediately. In case this tag is absent, then you have this as the first move instruction, where we have a guard condition which tells us whether the functional unit should execute the instruction immediately, or whether it should be delaying the execution to some extent. It can also cancel an operation in case the appropriate data is not made available in the trigger port of the particular functional unit. Okay. So that is the configuration of the move instruction, and similarly the second move instruction is present here, and there are some reserved immediate field which is present. Now this particular the number of bits which are needed to represent this can be pretty large, and is comparable to what is needed in a VLIW processor. Okay, so it can be somewhere around 150 bits that might be needed to carry out this particular thing. So this particular thing is what we call as the socket address and the opcode, which is the destination ID. And we saw that this destination ID is sort of used for determining the socket and where the socket will push the data into. So basically it's being sent through a multiplexer input port into the right port in the functional unit where it is supposed to be consumed. And the operation to be performed in the functional unit is given by this particular opcode here. So this is the format of the instruction that needs to be carried out. Okay, so you can also have the instructions being pipelined in the transport triggered architectures, and you have this instruction fetch, then decode, and then the move instructions being executed with possible functional unit operations extending over multiple clock cycles being present as shown here. So there is pipelining not only in the instructions, but also in the functional unit that is present. Okay. So here is the way in which we have a single bus thing which is present in a transport triggered architecture. So these are the operations which needs to be performed, and this is the manner in which you can carry out the operations appropriately. Okay, so I will. So since there is a single bus, all the instructions have to be executed sequentially, and therefore this is no different from what happens in a RISC or a CISC or a VLIW processor. Okay. Now, when I have 3 buses, then I can carry out the thing in a shorter number of clock cycles, because I can carry out concurrent operations being performed on all these functional units and other resources which are present as a part of the transport triggered architecture. And therefore, I can carry out the same operation in 5 clock cycles as opposed to what would be needed here in a single bus scenario, which needs 15 clock cycles to be executed. So that's the thing. The larger the number of buses, the longer is your instruction word, but then you can also finish the operations faster because you will need lesser number of clock cycles to execute the same set of instructions that needs to be executed and used. Okay. So I will, you can also optimize on the data transfers by making use of what we call as the bypass units. And in the bypass units, the output from the functional units need not be necessarily written into the register files, but they can be directly stored in other functional units where they would be subsequently consumed through the bypass unit. So that bypass unit is not shown in the earlier thing, but it is present as is also present in your RISC processors and also CISC processors. So you do have the bypass unit, which can result in things which can be achieved with just 3 data buses alone, as opposed to what was needed in the previous case with, the 3 buses still continue to be the same, but you need lesser number of operations to be performed because there are lesser instructions to be executed when you use the bypass unit. So this is an optimized version of the same unoptimized transport triggered architecture that is present here. I will skip the later part and then hand over the thing to my student Akshay, who can tell me, who can tell you about how the transport triggered architecture are sort of automatically generated in a co-design environment and how it is done. Okay. So I hand over to Akshay.
So the tool is called TTA-based code design environment, TCE tool. So the tool was basically led by the customized parallel group computing at the Temple University, Finland. So basically it provides a complete retargetable code design flow from high level language, which is the C code, to a synthesizable processor RTL code. So it will create, at the end, it will create an RTL code of the whole transport triggered architecture processor. And at the same time, it will give us the memory bit image. So it will give the instructions also, so that we can execute our target. So I'll start. So this is the flowchart of the code design environment. So basically, we start with the processor design. So in processor design, what we do is we create an architecture definition file. So basically, architecture definition file, ADF file, contains the functional unit which are needed for the transport triggered architecture processor. So we add the necessary functional units in this file. Similarly, at this stage, we can add our own customized unit as well, which will accelerate the performance further. Afterwards, when a processor, the ADF file is created, we move on to the simulation part. So in simulation part, what we do is we write an HLL code, high level language code. So the code is synthesized using the ADF file and HLL file, and it will create a target file. So this target file can be simulated in a graphical simulator, which is Proxim provided by this tool itself. Over here, we can see many parameters, such as we can see whether the output is getting produced correctly. Like we can see the variables, how the values are changing. At the same time, we can see the bottleneck. For example, which functionality is executed more number of times. So what is the bottleneck? We can see the number of clock cycles it is needed to produce the output, like that. So over here, we can see the bottleneck and we can provide the feedback to the user, and we can again change the ADF file according to your need to accelerate the process. And in the last stage, we can produce the RTL file. For RTL file, an HDB file is needed, which is the nothing but the VHDL implementation of the functional unit. So we can create the synthesized RTL version of the transport triggered processor. So these things will be clear as we move on. So we can start with an example of control data flow graph. So this is basically an example where we are going to implement this C code, and the functional units which are available to us are the two multiplier units and one ALU. So ALU is capable of performing addition, subtraction, comparison. So we should be able to get this code synthesized by using those three functional units itself. So we'll start with this example, and later we are gonna do the hand synthesized version of this example as well. So first we start with the processor design. Okay. So there are certain ADF files which are provided in the tools itself, which are the minimal ADF, minimal with std out. So we are minimal.adf is capable of performing any operation. So it has basically the minimum number of operations which are needed to simulate any C code. So we are going to start with the minimal ADF. So there is a simple command after installing the tool, which is the processor design start.adf. So by using that command, we can see the graphical visualization of the ADF file. So basically at the start, it contains a load store unit. There is an ALU, which is capable of performing this basic operation like addition, subtraction, comparison. Then there is a register file boolean, and this is the control unit, which is capable of doing the branch instructions like jump and call. So this is the basic ADF file which is provided in the tool itself. So now we want to modify according to your requirement. So now to modify, what we can do, just we can copy and paste the function unit, and then we can modify it. So as we need the two multiplier units, I have copied it the function unit twice, and then I have modified the just by clicking the right click, we can select the operations which we want to perform. So I have selected the two multiplier operations, and there is a and the normal ALU contains the basic arithmetic operations like addition, subtraction, comparison, all those. So after that, we want to connect this function unit to the bus. So just under there is an option tool to fully connect IC, which will connect this function unit with the socket, as the sir mentioned earlier. So the socket is connected to the port and the crossed one is the triggered port. So it is getting automatically connected to the bus now. But the problem with this is that there is only one bus provided at this time. So we can do only one operation at a time. So there is no point of adding multiple function units if we can't do the operation at this, if they can't do the all operation at the same time. So now to make this possible, we have added 3 buses. So this is also similar like the function unit. We can just Control C and Control V to add the add the 2 more buses, and then we can connect it to the function units. So now the ADF file is created, which was the basic requirement for the C code. Now the later part is the compilation and simulation. So the tool provides the compiler, which basically needs the ADF file, which with the help of ADF file, it will create a output file and the C code. And these are and we can retain some labels to verify whether our code is getting simulated right or wrong. So just by doing this, by giving this instruction, we can compile the C code, and it will create an assignment this .tpf file, which is not executable file, but it will be executable in this tool further on. Like after the output is created, we can so the transport ticket architecture, this TCU tool also has a graphical simulator, and there is a command window simulator as well. So this is an example of a graphical simulator. So the output file, which is created assignment.tpf, is opened over here. As we can see, these are the move instructions. All these are the move instruction. Like we mentioned that the transport ticket architecture has move instruction to move the data from one function unit into another register, from register to another function unit, like that. So these are the move operations of the C code which was earlier. So there is a command prompt which is given to us over here, which gives then various tools to us. Like for example, I can check the output of the variable x. So earlier I had labeled the x to check the output of the compiler. Similarly, we can see the how the function units are allocated, like which function unit is getting triggered many number of times, so that we can get the bottleneck, how many number of registers are getting used, if there is a less number of register units, then we can add another functional unit for a register block. So like that, we can modify the ADF file from statistics given over here, and then optimize the performance of the transport trigger architecture. Further, after the simulation, once we found that the code is getting simulated, we can later move on to create an RTL file of the transport trigger architecture and memory image, which is nothing but the instructions of this code. So basically, we can use the processor design tool, which is provided in this TCU only to create a processor implementation. So basically, what you in the tools, we can just select the processor implementation. Now, what it needs is that the VHDL implementation of each function unit to create an RTL implementation of whole transport trigger architecture. So now, what we need is the VHDL implementation of each function unit. So for basic operations, they have already provided the VHDL implementation of all operations. So we can auto select the implementation. So it will automatically select the implementation from the tool itself, the VHDL files for the implementation of each function unit. And then we can select the output, whether we want the RTL implementation in VHDL or Verilog. And we can also save the bit image file, which is nothing but the memory, which is nothing but the instruction code. And at the same time, it will also store the data memory as well. So over here, as we proceed, we can, and at the same time, there is an option for bus tracking as well. So if you want to verify the code for verification purposes, then we can use the bus trace file also. So which is also getting simulated. So this is the process for creating the processor and as well as the memory image. Then we can see this was the assignment.image was the memory instruction image file which was created. So it has 25 instructions as of now for this example. So this was done using the tool. Now I can show you then a simpler example. Which so for the same example, I have done the manual simulation of the problem as well. Any functional unit has a two operand. One of them is a triggering operand, and there should be 3 buses available to do the operation at the same time. So these are the operations. For example, over in these are the operations which were present in this example. So these are the operations, and this is the functional unit allocation, which is done by the same method as shown by the sir earlier. So these are the operation which is allotted to this is the multiplier 1, multiplier 2, and this is the ALU, and these are the stages. So these operations are allotted to this function unit. So this is then function unit allocation which is done by the internal FSM. Then this is the implementations. For example, operation 1. For example, in multiplier 1, the first operand is written with the register R1 value. For example, this operation 1 is doing the 3 into Rx. So the value of R1, the 3 is moved into the one of the operand of multiplier. Similarly, the R2, the X is moved into the one of the operand of multiplier 2, and this is a triggered one. So whenever an operand is written into a triggered port, it will start the operation. And in the next clock cycle, the output is M01 is created, and it can be moved to the R7. But now over here, the problem is that we are storing the result in the another register. But what we can do is we can store the operand. For example, 3 into X is used as a operation in another functional unit for next operation. For example, R7. Over here, the R7 is the result. R7 is used over in the operation 6. Now, to optimize the performance, what we can do is we can write the M01 register directly into the input operand of the next operation. So it will optimize the performance further ahead. So this is the compact version by which you can see that the number of instructions are considerably less over here. So there are just 24 move instructions by which we can do this loop completely. So this is for one iteration of the loop that we have got these move instructions. Yeah. So yeah. So over here in the last, the RTL files are created, and we can see we can get the statistics, and then we can optimize the performance. So this was the short overview that I have been doing as of now. Yeah. So thank you.
Thanks, Akshay. We'll just give a round of applause to the speakers. And thank you for attending today's talk. Thank you, everybody.